Usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, um, you expect a certain level of, like, cold clinical precision.
Right.
You break your arm, the x-ray shows a jagged white line across the radius bone, and the doctor just points at it and says, there is the problem.
Yeah, it's very binary.
Exactly. It's binary, broken or not broken.
Yeah.
You put a cast on it, and you know the exact mechanics of how it will heal.
And we really crave that kind of visibility, I think.
Oh, absolutely.
When things are easily categorized, they feel manageable. I mean, the human mind is just drawn to clear-cut causality.
But step out of the hospital and into the world of political revolutions, mass societal upheaval, and just total institutional collapse, and suddenly that x-ray machine is completely broken.
It's useless.
Right. You're no longer looking at a clean fracture. You are looking at a historical landscape that is, well, it's incredibly murky.
Yeah.
Diagnosing why a society fell apart or why a massive popular movement was suddenly crushed requires digging through layers of propaganda, economic obfuscation, and just sheer chaos.
And that diagnostic challenge is exactly the mission of our exploration today.
Yes, it is.
We are taking these dense, highly complex historical source materials and extracting the underlying mechanics of how these events function.
So you listening to this can get a real handle on it.
Right. The goal is to leave you with a deep understanding of the machinery of this era without drowning in the overwhelming flood of 19th century information.
And our journey today takes us straight into Volume 11 of the Marx and Engels collected works.
Often abbreviated as MECW in historical circles.
Right, the MECW. And we are examining a very specific, fiercely intense window of time here. We're looking at August 1851 to March 1853.
It's a really crucial period.
It is. But before we dive into the deep end, it is worth noting here for you listening, our goal today isn't to validate Marx and Engels' political ideology.
Definitely not.
Whether you lean left, right, or center today is entirely outside our scope. What we are doing is looking purely at the mechanics of their historical analysis.
Right. We're dissecting how they viewed the world through their specific ideological lens in 1851.
Exactly. We're just impartially reporting on the texts they produced. We aren't endorsing the views, just exploring the sources.
And to understand the text, you really first have to understand the trauma of the context.
Yeah.
Because this period, I mean, it represents a profound psychological and political whiplash.
I want you to imagine a Europe where the fiery, incredibly hopeful revolutions of 1848 and 1849, the uprisings that swept across the continent, particularly in places like Germany, Italy, and France, have been totally unequivocally defeated.
Just crushed.
Yeah. The Spring of Revolution, that brief, dizzying moment where it genuinely felt like the old absolute monarchies were crumbling into dust, has completely frozen over.
Right.
We're now in a bitter, unforgiving winter of counter-revolution. The old powers are back in charge, and they have learned from their near miss.
Oh, they learned a lot.
They are angry, they are organized, and they are cracking down hard.
And the sources explicitly state that the forces of reaction were consolidating their hold throughout Europe. The revolutionary movements in Germany and Italy, they had already been decisively crushed on the battlefield by 1849.
Right.
The traditional military powers had regrouped, utilized superior logistics and discipline, and essentially swept the civilian militias off the board.
Which brings up the core question of this deep dive. What do you do when your side has decisively lost?
Yeah, that's the big question.
The reactionary forces have completely consolidated power. As an intellectual, as an activist, do you just give up?
Right, or do you retreat into fantasy?
Exactly. Do you write utopian poetry about how great things could have been? Or do you get to work performing a cold, unsparing autopsy on your own movement?
And they chose the autopsy.
They did.
But to really understand their mindset, we have to look at the massive geopolitical shockwave that finalized this era of defeat.
Big one.
Yeah, the event that effectively snuffed out any lingering desperate hope for a quick revolutionary comeback.
The atmosphere was already gloomy. But then a very specific, very loud event occurred that defined this entire reactionary era.
Right.
We are moving our focus to France to December 10th, 1851.
The climax of the counter-revolution. Louis Napoleon's coup d'etat.
Louis Napoleon, the nephew of the original Napoleon Bonaparte.
That's the one.
He had been elected president of the French Second Republic, the republic established after the French king was overthrown in 1848.
Right.
And according to our sources, this Second Republic had still retained at least some democratic institutions, even if it was, heavily fractured.
Yeah, it had a constitution.
It had a constitution, it had National Assembly, it had competing political parties.
It was a fragile ecosystem, definitely, but it provided a legal framework for political opposition.
Right.
Louis Napoleon, however, leveraged his uncle's massive historical legacy. He cultivated the military, he appealed to the conservative peasantry who, feared socialist instability in the cities. And he built a private network of loyalists. And because the Constitution prevented him from running for a second term, well, he simply dismantled the Constitution.
On the night of December 1st into the morning of December 2nd, he launched a self-coup.
Wow.
Yeah, this wasn't a popular uprising. This was a surgical strike from the top down. His loyal generals occupied Paris with troops. They seized the printing presses so the opposition couldn't publish any resistance.
Classic move.
Totally. They arrested the leading politicians of the National Assembly right in their beds. By the time Paris woke up, the Second Republic was dead.
And out of those ashes, the sources observed the birth of the Bonapartist monarchy.
Right.
He extends his term, rewrites the Constitution to give himself dictatorial powers, and eventually crowns himself Emperor Napoleon III.
This feels exactly like a corporate hostile takeover.
Totally.
Imagine a fledgling startup, the Second Republic, trying to establish a new democratic corporate culture.
Okay, I see where you're going.
The board brings in a CEO with a famous last name to manage the transition and soothe the investors.
Right.
But instead of managing the company, the CEO quietly buys off the security guards, locks the board of directors out of the building in the middle of the night, shreds the company charter, and declares himself the sole owner of a newly formed monopoly.
That analogy perfectly captures the administrative ruthlessness of the event.
Yeah.
And the sources emphasize that this wasn't just a localized tragedy for French Republicans. The geopolitical fallout was immense.
Right.
The text describes this new Bonapartist monarchy as a newly forged bulwark of reaction in Europe and a hotbed of international conflict and military escapades.
France had been the anchor of European revolutions in 1789.
Yeah.
Now, suddenly, France is the anchor holding down the conservative status quo alongside the absolute monarchs of Russia, Prussia, and Austria.
The counter-revolutionary order was firmly established. Any theoretical models Marx and Engels had built around the idea of an imminent, spontaneous uprising of the Parisian working class had to be thrown out the window.
Which is an incredible intellectual crisis.
It really is.
If you're Marx or Engels, you have built your entire worldview on the inevitable uprising of the working people.
Right.
How do you theoretically process a dictator successfully dismantling a republic from the inside out, seemingly with the passive acceptance, or at least the inability to resist, of the very masses you thought were going to lead the future?
Yeah, it completely contradicts the narrative of inevitable progressive momentum.
Exactly.
They had to recognize that the state apparatus is not just a neutral vessel waiting to be captured by whichever class has the best arguments.
Right, it's not neutral at all.
No, the state has its own massive bureaucratic, military, and administrative weight. Louis Napoleon proved that a sufficiently ruthless executive could wield that machinery to suppress popular movements, bypassing the traditional political class entirely. It forced them to realize that the state itself, with its standing army and centralized administration, was an active, heavy participant in class conflict, not just a referee.
So they can't be field generals for a revolution anymore. The window has slammed shut.
Right.
There is no army left to call to arms. Instead of issuing manifestos for future action, they turn their attention backward.
Yeah.
They perform autopsy on the failed revolutions. And our deep dive today zooms in specifically on how they analyzed Germany.
And the German situation provides the perfect laboratory for this autopsy.
How so?
Well, a major portion of Volume 11 comprises a serialized work by Friedrich Engels titled Revolution and Counter-Revolution in Germany.
Right.
And the venue for this publication is fascinating. It was published extensively in the New York Daily Tribune between 1851 and 1852.
The New York Daily Tribune. Not an underground radical pamphlet handed out in European taverns,
Yeah.
but a massive American newspaper with hundreds of thousands of readers.
Yeah, it's a huge shift.
It really shows how exiled writers had to adapt, finding new platforms across the Atlantic, because the European presses were either heavily censored or totally shut down by the reactionary governments.
Exactly.
So Engels sits down to write this postmortem for an American audience. How does he actually structure the breakdown of such a chaotic event?
He begins by mapping out the sheer geographic and political fragmentation of the region.
Right, because it wasn't one country.
No, Germany in 1848 was not the unified nation-state we picture today. It was a dizzying patchwork of dozens of kingdoms, duchies, and principalities, all loosely connected in the German Confederation.
Okay.
Engels systematically breaks this down into spheres of power. He dedicates a chapter to the Prussian state, the aggressive, highly militarized powerhouse in the north. He has another for the other German states, dealing with the smaller, often more liberal entities in the south and west.
Right.
And crucially, he includes a chapter on Austria, the sprawling, multi-ethnic empire to the southeast that exerted massive traditional influence over the German-speaking world.
He is mapping the anatomy of the patient before explaining how the patient died.
Exactly.
Setting the stage, laying out the different fiefdoms and their competing interests.
And from that geopolitical map, he moves to the kinetic action. He analyzes the insurrections chapter by chapter, the Vienna insurrection, the Berlin insurrection, the Paris Rising. He is digging into the tactical reality of what happened when the citizens built barricades and faced off against regular standing armies.
Here is where the historical mechanisms get incredibly intricate.
Oh, very.
The sources show Engels going far beyond a simple narrative of, like, the oppressed people fighting the evil kings.
Right. It's not that simple.
He dives deeply into the complex ethnic and nationalist tensions that actively sabotage the revolutionary forces from within.
Because the romantic ideal of 1848 was the springtime of the peoples, right? A universal brotherhood of nations throwing off the yoke of monarchy.
Yeah, that was the dream.
But Engels' Autopsy reveals the brutal reality. Nationalism was actually the great wedge issue that destroyed that universal brotherhood.
He writes chapters titled Poles, Czechs, and Germans, Pan-Slavism, and the Schleswig-Holstein War. He points out that while everyone might have agreed they hated the absolute monarch in Vienna or Berlin, they absolutely hated each other when it came to drawing the borders of their hypothetical new republics.
Right, that's where things broke down.
You had German revolutionaries who demanded democratic rights for themselves, suddenly becoming fierce imperialists when Polish or Czech revolutionaries demanded those exact same rights in territories the Germans considered their own.
And the old monarchies understood this dynamic perfectly and weaponized it.
Of course they did.
The Austrian Empire, for instance, was brilliant at playing these emerging nationalisms against one another.
How so?
Well, if the German-speaking citizens of Vienna rose up in democratic revolt, the emperor would bring in loyal Slavic troops from other parts of the empire, troops who had no sympathy for the German liberals to crush the uprising. Yeah. Engels' analysis painfully acknowledges that this lack of international solidarity, this descent into parochial nationalism, was a fatal vulnerability.
And then you look at their attempt to solve this chaos politically.
Right.
The sources highlight Engels' chapter on the Frankfurt National Assembly. This is supposed to be the great democratic hope.
Well, he's supposed to be, yeah.
Liberal and democratic delegates from across the German states converging on Frankfurt to literally write a constitution and forge a unified German nation.
Yeah, but the delegates were largely professors, lawyers, and intellectuals. They were tasked with building a state from scratch.
Reading Engels' description of this assembly, it sounds like the ultimate nightmare scenario of a bad group project.
Oh, absolutely.
Like half the team is speaking different languages, the other half is actively trying to sabotage the final grade, and no one can agree on the thesis statement.
That is a perfect way to describe it.
They spent months locked in parliamentary debates over the abstract fundamental rights of the German people. They debated philosophical definitions of citizenship, while the actual kings and princes, who had only temporarily retreated, were quietly rebuilding their military logistics and planning their counteroffensives.
Because they possessed the moral high ground, but zero coercive power.
Oh.
They didn't control an army, they didn't control the tax revenues, and they didn't control the bureaucracy.
Right.
Engels points out that in a revolution, hesitation is fatal. While the Frankfurt Assembly debated theory, the Prussian and Austrian militaries executed hard power.
It begs the question, Looking at this autopsy, does Engels conclude that these revolutions failed because of an internal lack of centralized, decisive coordination among the revolutionaries? Or was it external? Were they just inevitably going to be overwhelmed by the sheer, entrenched military power of the existing states, no matter how well organized they were?
The autopsy reveals a tragic synthesis of both, actually.
Really?
Yeah. The revolutionaries had the initial momentum and the sheer numbers in the spring of 1848. If they had moved decisively to dismantle the old military apparatus and establish an aggressive, unified command, they might have succeeded.
Wow.
But they squandered that momentum in endless parliamentary debates and nationalist squabbles.
Like the Frankfurt Assembly.
Exactly. By the time they realized the monarchies were moving against them, it was too late. The existing state powers had the military discipline, the supply lines, and the ruthlessness to take the territory back street by street.
So the political superstructure of the revolution was completely broken.
Yeah.
The barricades were cleared, the parliaments were dissolved, and the military is back in charge.
Right.
But Marx and Engels believed you couldn't fully understand this failure just by looking at the actions of politicians in Frankfurt or the tactical mistakes of militias in Berlin. You have to look underneath the political floorboards. You have to look at the economic realities.
Which brings us to the profound shift in their operational strategy during this 1851-1853 window. With political action in the streets completely thwarted, they had to transition their struggle to a new battlefield.
They trade the sword for the pen.
Exactly.
They move into the realm of journalism, poverty, and economics. The sources show an absolute explosion of journalistic output from both men during this specific period.
And again, heavily featured in the New York Daily Tribune, but also in a radical British Chartist publication called the People's Paper.
Right.
And the sheer volume of data they are processing is staggering. They are no longer writing philosophical treatises. They are writing real-time economic dispatches.
When you look at the titles of Marx's articles from this era, it paints a bleak, incredibly sharp socioeconomic picture of the world they were observing. We see titles like Pauperism and Free Trade, The Approaching Commercial Crisis.
Elections, Financial Clouds, The Duchess of Sutherland and Slavery.
Then there is this one, Political Prospects.
Yeah.
Commercial Prosperity. Case of Starvation.
Right.
Just boom, boom, boom. The juxtaposition in that title alone is a masterclass in narrative framing.
Oh, definitely.
Commercial Prosperity.
Yeah.
Right next to Case of Starvation. What exactly are the mechanics of what they are doing with this journalism?
Well, they're inventing a form of deeply critical, data-driven, investigative journalism.
Okay.
In the 1850s, the official narrative in Britain, which was the engine of global capitalism at the time, was that the repeal of protectionist tariffs and the embrace of free trade was ushering in an era of unprecedented commercial prosperity.
Right. Everyone's getting rich, supposedly.
Exactly. Politicians and bankers pointed to soaring export numbers and booming factory production as proof that the system was working flawlessly.
But Marx and Engels are looking at those exact same macroeconomic indicators and pointing out the massive blind spots.
Yeah.
They're saying, yes, your trade returns are high, but look at the local poorhouses. Look at the spike in the mortality rate. Look at the displacement of domestic labor.
They are meticulously showing how the wealth generated at the top of the supply chain was actively dependent on extracting cheaper and cheaper labor at the bottom. They analyzed parliamentary reports, trade deficit ledgers, and agricultural yields to prove that free trade in this specific historical context was actually accelerating pauperism.
The total destitution of the working class.
Exactly. The prosperity and the starvation weren't two separate phenomenons. One was the mechanical requirement for the other.
They're pulling the receipts.
Yeah.
They are taking the government's own blue books, their own statistical reports, and weaponizing them against the official narrative.
It's brilliant.
And they don't stop at the economy. They engage in intense institutional critiques. There's an article titled Parliamentary Debates, The Clergy Against Socialism, Starvation.
Notice how they link the institutions there.
Yeah.
They are examining how the moral authorities, the church and the clergy, collude with the political authorities in parliament to justify the economic suffering.
Oh, wow.
If the clergy preaches that poverty is a moral failing or a divine test, it provides cover for the parliament to avoid passing relief laws for the starving populace.
It is a systemic critique. The economic engine creates the poverty, the parliament protects the economic engine, and the church provides the moral justification for the whole loop.
Right.
How does this journalistic tone, this obsession with data and institutional mechanics, differ from their earlier writings in 1848?
The contrast is really stark. In 1848, the tone was a clarion call to arms.
Right.
The Communist Manifesto, written just before the revolutions, was a brilliant, fiery piece of political rhetoric designed to mobilize a mass movement for immediate, forceful change. But by 1851, the masses have been demobilized by force. You cannot write a call to arms when the military has declared martial law.
Good point.
So the tone shifts from mobilization to structural exposure.
They become structural analysts.
Yes.
They are proving to the reading public why the system functions the way it does. They're essentially saying, don't just take our philosophical word for it that capitalism is flawed. Look at your own government's trade reports on pauperism. Look at the mathematical cycles of boom and bust. They were using the 1850s economic boom as a laboratory to prove that these cycles inevitably produce a massive crash, the approaching commercial crisis they kept writing about.
But, exposing the mechanics of the British and European economies in major newspapers comes with severe risks.
Oh, I'm sure.
The European states were actively monitoring dissident writers. You cannot publish articles exposing the hypocrisy of the ruling class without attracting the attention of the police state.
Which brings us to the physical, day-to-day reality of being a radical in the 1850s, the crackdown on dissent and the politics of exile.
Right.
The golden rule of this reactionary era seems to be, if you can't fight in the streets, you write. But writing makes you a highly visible target.
And Volume 11 contains texts that vividly illustrate this peril.
Yeah.
One of the most significant documents is the anonymously published Revelations concerning the communist trial in Cologne.
Okay.
The fact that Marx had to publish this in Boston, Massachusetts, demonstrates the total suppression of the press in mainland Europe.
Wow, all the way in Boston.
Yeah, he had to send the manuscript across the Atlantic just to find a printer who wouldn't be raided by the police.
Let's dig into the mechanics of this. What actually was the communist trial in Cologne?
The Cologne Communist Trial of 1852 was, it was a masterclass in state-sponsored legal persecution.
Okay.
The Prussian government arrested a group of 11 Communist League members, associates of Marx and Engels, who had remained in Germany, and put them on trial for high treason.
Right.
The Prussian state wanted a spectacular show trial to legally exterminate the remnants of the radical labor movement and justify their ongoing police crackdown.
But the sources indicate that the evidence for this treason was entirely fabricated.
Completely.
How does a state actually engineer a frame-up of that magnitude?
Marx wrote the Revelations specifically to dissect that forgery step by step.
Okay.
He exposed how the chief of the Prussian political police, a man named Wilhelm Stieber, operated a vast network of spies and provocateurs across Europe. When the police couldn't find actual evidence of a treasonous plot, they simply manufactured it. Wow.
They broke into desks, they intercepted mail, and most notoriously, they produced a forged original minute book of the Communist League.
Wait, so the police literally sat down and wrote a fake diary of treason, attributing it to the defendants?
Yes.
It's insane.
It is. Marx used his investigative skills to prove that the handwriting belonged to known police informants, that the dates of the supposed secret meetings physically contradicted where the defendants actually were, and that the entire narrative was a concoction designed to terrify the conservative jury into handing down guilty verdicts.
The state weaponizing its courts and police, not for the pursuit of justice, but as instruments of political extermination.
Exactly.
Marx is writing the Revelations to defend his comrades, but it reads as a furious, meticulous indictment of the entire Prussian justice system.
It was a tense, dangerous environment. The threat of imprisonment or extradition hung over everyone.
Right.
But the crackdown produced another, more insidious psychological phenomenon among the radicals who managed to escape.
The sources point to a piece titled The Great Men of the Exile, which explores the internal rot of the refugee community.
When the revolutions failed, thousands of political activists, former ministers, journalists, militia leaders, fled across borders to places like Switzerland, the United States, and especially London.
Yeah.
They became political refugees.
Yeah.
What does The Great Men of the Exile reveal about that specific ecosystem?
It is a biting, satirical, and ultimately tragic look at the bizarre reality of exile politics.
Okay.
You had all these formerly important figures crammed into cheap, damp boarding houses in Soho, London. They had no money, no armies, and no political power.
Right.
But instead of analyzing why they lost, they formed imaginary governments in exile. They issued grandiose proclamations to a European public that could no longer hear them or no longer cared.
The sources mentioned earlier political fractures that fueled this toxicity, like the events in Karlsruhe in June 1849, where a radical wing called the Club of Resolute Progress clashed with the more moderate Brentano provisional government.
Right, and those ideological civil wars didn't end when the actual war was lost.
They just kept fighting.
The exiles just carried those bitter arguments into the pubs of London. The factionalism was intense.
Wow.
They spent their time violently arguing over who was the true revolutionary, who betrayed the cause, and dividing themselves into increasingly obscure, microscopic political sects.
It sounds like a psychological pressure cooker.
Oh, absolutely.
On one hand, you have the Prussian state literally throwing your friends in jail in Cologne, using forged evidence, hunting you across borders.
Yeah.
On the other hand, you were surrounded by these great men in exile, trapped in a delusional echo chamber, fighting over imaginary cabinet positions for a government that doesn't exist.
It's absurd.
How did this incredibly toxic, isolating environment affect Marx and Engels' theoretical work? Because it feels like a terrible environment for deep, objective thinking.
The isolation was severe, but adversity has a way of clarifying purpose. Their utter disgust with the petty factionalism and the delusions of the exile community forced Marx and Engels to rigorously defend and refine their own theoretical ground.
Right.
They essentially withdrew from the squabbling exile circles. They realized that mingling with people who refused to accept reality was intellectual poison. So they retreated to the reading room of the British Museum.
They had to make sure their foundation was rock solid.
Yeah.
They couldn't afford to be delusional.
Exactly.
Which brings us to the final major theme of Volume 11, Intellectual Skirmishes, Fighting Over Abstractions versus Reality. The physical defeat on the barricades led directly to a massive, unforgiving battle over ideas.
When physical action is impossible, the battleground invariably becomes ideological.
Right.
If you want to lead a future movement, you have to establish the correct theoretical framework now. Volume 11 includes several fascinating examples of these intellectual skirmishes, where they mercilessly critiqued both friends and enemies.
One of the prime examples in the sources is Engels' manuscript titled Critical Review of Proudhon's book, Idées générales de la Révolution au notre siècle.
Yes.
Pierre-Joseph Proudhon was a massively influential French socialist and anarchist thinker, yet Marx and Engels spent immense energy attacking him.
They did.
They weren't just fighting right-wing monarchs, they were ruthlessly critiquing other people on the left.
They attacked Proudhon because they believed his economic theories were fundamentally disconnected from the mechanical reality of industrial capitalism.
Okay.
They believed that bad theory inevitably leads to failed revolutions. If your blueprint for a new society is based on a misunderstanding of how capital actually flows, your movement will collapse the moment it takes power.
But an even more revealing critique in the sources is their attack on a military theorist named Willison, who wrote a book called Théorie des Gros Conflits, or A Theory of the Great War.
The critique of Willison is incredibly telling.
How so?
The sources specifically note that Marx and Engels attacked Willison because he based the science of war on abstract, philosophical propositions instead of observable facts.
Abstract philosophical propositions instead of observable facts.
Right.
That phrase right there feels like the Rosetta Stone for their entire intellectual project during this era.
It is the absolute cornerstone of their worldview in the 1850s.
Yep.
Whether they are analyzing military maneuvers with Willison or economic theories with Proudhon, their demand is unrelenting. You must privilege empirical, grounded reality over wishful thinking.
This is the ultimate critique of the armchair general.
Exactly.
They are looking at Willison and saying, you cannot win a war by sitting in a study and writing elegant philosophical poetry about the metaphysical nature of human conflict.
No, you can't.
You need to know the topography of the battlefield.
Yeah.
You need to know exactly how many boots are on the ground, what the logistics of the supply chain look like, the maximum range of the artillery, and how many tons of bread are actually available to feed the infantry.
And they applied that exact same empirical standard to politics.
Right.
They were saying to the utopian socialists of their era, you cannot overthrow a capitalist state just by designing a perfectly ethical, morally pure alternative society in your imagination. The state doesn't care about your morals. You have to understand the brutal mechanics of how pauperism, free trade, and industrial production actually interact in the physical world.
But consider the massive paradox at play here. I have to push back on this setup.
Okay, let's hear it.
They are relentlessly attacking people for being out of touch with reality, for being armchair generals. But aren't Marx and Engels themselves literal exiled writers at this point?
We are.
They're sitting in London, thousands of miles away from the action, critiquing European military campaigns and German political economies from afar. Aren't they in extreme danger of becoming the exact armchair generals they despise?
That is a very sharp observation, and it highlights the exact trap they were terrified of falling into. They recognize the hypocrisy of critiquing from afar, which is precisely why they completely buried themselves in raw data. They refused to rely on the romantic memories of 1848. They wanted to know what the price of wheat was in London in 1852. They wanted to know the exact tonnages of cotton flowing through Manchester.
That explains the journalism.
Yes.
By forcing themselves to write those weekly, deeply researched pieces for the New York Daily Tribune, analyzing parliamentary debates, tracking trade deficits, exposing the demographic realities of starvation, they tethered their own theories to observable contemporary facts.
Their journalism was their anchor.
Right.
It was their mechanism for ensuring they didn't float away into the ideological stratosphere and become just another pair of great men of the exile, lost in their own philosophical abstractions. They forced themselves to interact with the ugly, boring spreadsheets of the global economy.
Oh, that completely recontextualizes their work. Writing about the approaching commercial crisis wasn't just them fulfilling a word count for an American newspaper to pay rent. It was a disciplined exercise in facing reality.
And they brought a massive amount of cultural literacy to that exercise.
Right.
Before we move to the conclusion, there is one fascinatingly odd reference in the text that the outline highlights, which perfectly encapsulates the sheer breadth of their commentary.
Yes, I saw this in the notes and it completely threw me. A reference to the Holy Grail.
Yes, the sources note a reference to the Holy Grail, the miraculous cup of Christ's blood from Arthurian and medieval legend.
How does that fit into economic spreadsheets?
It appears in their texts as a metaphorical device. It showcases that their commentaries weren't just dry, lifeless economic spreadsheets.
Right.
They were incredibly well-read, drawing on a rich tapestry of cultural, literary, and historical references, using everything from classical antiquity to medieval mythology to mock their enemies and illustrate the sheer absurdity of contemporary politics.
Oh, I love that.
They would compare the Prussian king's quest for divine right to a misguided quest for the Grail. It shows the immense intellectual bandwidth they were operating with.
It's incredible. Going from analyzing the granular price of bread in a London slum, to exposing police forgery in Cologne, to dropping Holy Grail metaphors to roast the Prussian state.
It's quite the range.
The bandwidth is truly staggering. Let's try to pull all of these threads together.
Okay.
In this deep dive, we have explored a highly specific, fiercely intense window of time, 1851 to 1853.
Right.
We watched as Marx and Engels navigated a Europe that was suddenly and violently dominated by a victorious reactionary counter-revolution, climaxing with Louis Napoleon's midnight coup. We tracked their journey from dissecting the failure of the German revolutions, identifying how nationalist friction and political hesitation doomed the movement to their massive journalistic barrage against the hypocrisy of commercial prosperity, masking mass poverty. And finally, we saw their fierce, unrelenting defense of observable, empirical facts against abstract philosophy, fighting intellectual battles in the isolation of exile to ensure their theories remained anchored to the physical world.
And when we synthesize all of this material, the core takeaway for the listener is profound.
What would you say it is?
It is a lesson in how to respond to defeat and systemic confusion.
Okay.
When you are faced with a massive overload of conflicting information, or when you witness the complete defeat of a movement or an ideal you care deeply about, the natural human instinct is to retreat.
Yeah.
You want to retreat into comforting abstractions, into nostalgia, or perhaps into the bitter, petty factionalism that consumed the exiles in London.
Right.
But what these sources fiercely demonstrate is that the most effective, durable response is rigorous, factual, unsparing analysis of why things are the way they are. You have to look at the observable facts, no matter how grim or discouraging they might be.
You cannot just look at the murky X-ray and wish for a clean break. You have to stare at the shadows, study the surrounding tissue, and understand the mechanics of the trauma.
That translates to engaging with reality on its own terms, not the terms you wish existed.
That is incredibly powerful. And it leaves me with one final thought to mull over, and I want to leave you listening to this with this concept as well.
Okay.
The sources show us that in this 1851 period, the forces of reaction seemed entirely, overwhelmingly victorious, leaving absolutely no prospect for fresh revolution in the near term.
Right, it looked hopeless.
But it makes you wonder, does the complete and total triumph of the status quo naturally sow the seeds of its own eventual collapse?
Oh, that's an interesting thought.
Does a victorious counter-revolution actually guarantee its own future demise by forcing its sharpest critics to stop dreaming about utopian ideals, stop arguing in the streets, and start rigorously studying the observable, mechanical facts of the system?
That's a great question.
It's a question worth chewing on as you look at the world today. Keep diving deep, and we'll see you next time.